The moment I unfolded the yellowed envelope, found in the false bottom of an old wooden chest, the world I had built brick by brick for 68 years simply ceased to exist. I had always prided myself on the fact that my family was a paragon of honesty, that we had never kept secrets from one another. But the letter, written in my father's trembling hand the day before he died, screamed the exact opposite. I sat in my rocking chair, staring at the familiar handwriting, feeling cold sweat roll down my back, knowing that what was written on these scraps of paper didn't just rewrite my past, it made me a stranger in my own home. I knew that by the end of this journey, once I untangled this web of lies, I would never be the same person again, and that thought frightened me more than death itself. All this time I had believed our family history was a tale of struggle, of losing my mother during the war, and of how my father had single-handedly pulled us out of poverty, but the truth I held in my hands had a completely different flavor, the taste of a betrayal so profound I couldn't even grasp it yet. It all started last week when I decided to clear out the attic. The old house, where I had spent my childhood and raised my own children, had become too big for me, and I was preparing it for sale. My hands moved instinctively toward things I hadn't touched in decades: school textbooks, broken toys, boxes of photographs that had almost faded away. When I pushed aside the heavy oak dresser to make some space, I noticed that one of the floorboards was slightly loose. Out of a curiosity that perhaps all old men possess, I pried it up with a screwdriver. Beneath it lay a mahogany box, the very same one I had seen in my father's study back in the distant 60s, and which I had assumed was lost forever after his funeral. My heart sank into my stomach. I remembered how my father always hid the keys from us, how he would flinch whenever one of us approached his desk too closely. I opened the lock, which gave way with a strange, almost mournful creak. Inside were a few documents, a pair of tiny baby shoes I had never seen before, and that very letter. When I began to read, I couldn't believe my eyes. My father was not addressing me, but someone I had never known, a woman whose name had never been spoken in our household. He wrote about a debt he could never repay, about a guilt that had weighed him down until his final breath, and about the man who was actually my real father. I reread the line 3 times, hoping that my eyesight was failing me, that old age had finally clouded my mind for good, but every word was clear and merciless. The father I had adored, who had been my only moral compass, had lived his entire life in fear that someone would discover the truth about that winter of '45, when everything changed forever. I looked up and gazed out the window at our old garden, and for the first time in my life, it felt as though these trees, these paths, and even these walls didn't belong to me. Who was I then? Whose eyes did I see in the mirror every morning if they weren't the eyes of the man whose surname I carried? And above all, why had he kept silent for so long? Why had he allowed me to live for nearly 70 years in this sweet, poisonous delusion? I heard the front door click shut downstairs. My son had returned, completely unaware of anything. I quickly tucked the letter back into the box, hid it under my jacket, and felt the heavy weight of the lie suddenly become a part of my own body. How was I to live now, looking into the eyes of my loved ones, knowing that I was nothing more than the product of a grand mistake, for which someone perhaps had paid a price far higher than I could ever imagine? The house felt like a stranger's property, filled with echoes of a ghost I didn't know. I spent the next 3 days in a daze, unable to face my son, David, or his wife, Claire. I pretended to be busy with the attic, dragging boxes back and forth, but my mind was anchored to those words on the page. I began to piece together the fragments of the past that I had long ignored, the way my father would look at me with a mixture of profound love and deep, unshakable sorrow, as if he were constantly apologizing for my very existence. I recalled how he'd avoid the town of Krovlyoff, the place where he'd allegedly met my mother, always making excuses about the roads or the distance. Now, the map of my life looked like a crime scene, with every landmark pointing to a lie. On the 4th day, I couldn't bear the isolation any longer. I took the box, wrapped it in a towel, and drove to Krovlyoff. I hadn't been there in 40 years. The town had changed, but the sense of dread that pooled in my gut felt frozen in time. I went to the local archives, my hands shaking so violently I had to hold my wrist to sign the visitor log. I searched for records from 1945, looking for the woman mentioned in the letter, a woman named Eleanor. I found a death certificate. She had died in the winter of '45, the same month I was born. But as I flipped the page, I saw an entry that stopped my heart. A birth record for a baby boy, born on the exact same day as me, at the very same local infirmary. But the name listed wasn't mine. It was a name I recognized from the town's old merchant registry, a family that had been wiped out during the political purges shortly after the war. My father hadn't just met my mother. He had taken me from a dying woman and claimed me as his own, using the chaos of the post-war turmoil to hide a child of an enemy of the state. I felt sick, literally reeling from the weight of it. I had spent my life thinking I was the son of a war hero, but I was the collateral damage of a quiet, desperate theft. I left the archives, the air outside feeling thin and impossible to breathe. I walked to the edge of the old cemetery, looking for the name I had seen on the certificate. There, under a row of gnarled oaks, was a marker I had walked past 1,000 times in my dreams without knowing it. It wasn't my mother's grave, it was a memorial for the family that had disappeared. That's when I saw him, an old man, leaning on a cane, staring at the same marker. He turned, and our eyes met. He didn't look like a stranger. He looked like a mirror. He was the brother of the woman I now knew was my mother, the one person who had been searching for the truth for decades. He didn't say a word. He just walked toward me, his eyes brimming with a mix of recognition and ancient grief. "I've waited," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "I've waited my whole life to see if you survived." In that second, the reality of my life, my career, my children, my quiet, orderly retirement, felt like a fragile glass sculpture shattering against a stone floor. I wasn't just a man who had discovered a secret, I was a man who had lost his identity. The anger at my father surged up, white-hot and blinding, but it was quickly replaced by a terrifying, hollow loneliness. I asked the old man what happened, why no one had ever come for me, and the answer he gave turned the last remaining piece of my world into dust. My father hadn't stolen me to save me from the state. He had stolen me because he had caused the death of the only woman he ever truly loved, and he had spent his life raising me as a penance, a living, breathing monument to his own guilt. Everything I had called love was just a long, agonizing apology. I stood in that graveyard, the biting wind whipping through my coat, while the old man, my uncle, as he now claimed to be, spoke of a winter in 1945 that was far bloodier than any history book dared to record. He told me that my father, a man I had revered as a saint, had been a desperate opportunist during the war's chaotic final months. He hadn't just found me. He had caused the accident that claimed my biological mother's life during a frantic escape from the advancing front lines. He had taken me not out of some grand, noble impulse to protect a child, but because he was terrified that if anyone found me, a child of the family he had just inadvertently doomed, they would trace the crime back to him. I felt a coldness settle in my bones that no summer could ever thaw. The man who had taught me how to fish, how to respect elders, and how to hold my head high in the face of hardship had been a man built on the foundation of a homicide. Every birthday gift, every college tuition check, every warm hug he had ever given me was nothing more than a desperate bribe to his own conscience, an attempt to buy forgiveness from a God he didn't believe in, and a son he was terrified would one day uncover the rot beneath the floorboards. I returned home that evening to find the house dark and silent. David and Claire had already gone to bed. I walked into the kitchen, the moonlight filtering through the curtains and illuminating the table where I had sat with my father for so many years. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I realized then that my identity wasn't just a lie. It was a performance. I had been an actor in a play I hadn't written, starring in a role that was meant to be my father's absolution. The irony of it was suffocating. I had spent my entire life trying to be like him, striving to mirror his perceived integrity, his stoic kindness, and his quiet strength. I had molded my entire character after a man whose life was a singular, elaborate cover-up. And now, at the age of 68, with my own children and grandchildren calling me Grandpa with that same trust I had once placed in him, I was faced with a choice that felt like a razor's edge. Do I tear down the house of cards? Do I tell my children that their grandfather was a criminal and that their own bloodline is a fiction, a borrowed legacy built on a grave? I walked over to the fireplace, the old mahogany box in my hands. I thought about the birth certificate, the letters, the proof of my true origin. I looked at the fire, its flames dancing with an indifference that was almost mocking. If I burned it, the truth would die with me, and my family would continue their lives under the comfortable, fabricated history I had provided them. They would be happy, safe, and entirely deceived, but if I spoke, I would shatter them as I had been shattered. I realized then that the final bitter irony of my life was this: I had inherited his burden. By choosing silence, I became exactly like him. I tossed the letters and the box into the flames. I watched as the history of my true parents, the story of my theft, and the evidence of my father's sin curled into black ash and floated up the chimney. I sat there until the fire died down to embers, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. I walked upstairs to my room, lay down beside my wife, and listened to the rhythmic sound of her breathing. I had kept the secret to protect them, just as he had. I was his son, after all, not by blood, but by the very deception that defined us both. I closed my eyes, a prisoner of a peace that was entirely and forever a lie.